So now that we've established the role of the court, I want to talk about what your book describes as the three eras of the Supreme Court. Before we do that, though, I forgot to turn off the format thing in Keynote. So you got a little Easter egg there. You got to see the format window. It's very exciting. It's what we in the biz call an Easter egg or a DVD bonus extra. So it's a big day here in American government. But back to the three eras. Basically, there are three separate major issue domains the court has dealt with over time. The first is the boundaries of national versus state authority. What exactly are the powers of the national government, and what exactly are the powers of the state governments? What are the boundaries of our federalist system of government? Clearly, the Constitution only provided a general outline for these things, so the court would be left to fill in the gaps through case law. The big case citation here is the case of McCulloch versus Maryland in 1816. Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States, and then in 1818, the state of Maryland passed legislation to impose taxes on this bank. James W. McCulloch, the cashier of the Baltimore branch of the bank, refused to pay this tax. The state of Maryland gets mad, sues, and the case goes to the Supreme Court. The case presented two questions. First, did Congress have the authority to establish a national bank? Second, did the Maryland law unconstitutionally interfere with government congressional powers? In a unanimous decision, the court held that Congress has the power to incorporate the bank, and that Maryland could not tax instruments of the national government employed in the execution of constitutional powers. Writing for the court, Chief Justice Marshall noted that Congress possessed unenumerated powers not explicitly outlined in the Constitution. The argument he made here was that the power to tax is the power to destroy, and that because the federal government is above the state governments cannot have the power to destroy the federal government. If it is necessary and proper for the government to have a bank, if we expect the federal government to regulate interstate commerce, it certainly is, then they can charter banks to hold their money. Because chartering these banks is a necessary federal function to regulate interstate commerce, the states cannot have the right to tax it and potentially destroy it. This case firmly established the supremacy of the federal government over the states, setting up the first era. The second era was the role of the federal government in the economy. What responsibility does the federal government have in the role of the economy, and how does this affect people's property rights? Well, we begin this era with the case of Lochner v. New York in 1905. In this case, the state of New York enacted a statute forbidding bakers to work more than 60 hours a week or 10 hours a day. Lochner, coincidentally the owner of Lochner's Bakery, argued that this law violated his rights because the government had no business interfering with the employer-employee contract, effectively taking away his rights without due process of law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. So, the question is, does the New York law violate the liberty protected by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment? In a split decision, the court invalidated the New York law. The majority maintained that the statute interfered with the freedom of contract, and thus the 14th Amendment's right to liberty afforded to employer and employee. The court viewed the statute as a labor law, and the state had no reasonable ground for interfering with liberty by determining the hours of labor. So, we begin very clearly with the courts asserting the federal government has no right to enter into the relationship between employers and employees. Two consenting adults who decide to enter into a contract together, that's all valid as long as everyone agrees to the terms. However, smash cut to 24 years later, 1929, we see the beginning of the Great Depression. The economy has completely crashed, and we're looking to the federal government to bail us out of this unprecedented crisis. So FDR begins to pass all of his New Deal programs, introducing a level of government interference into the economy that we had never previously seen. Under the precedent set by Lochner, the Supreme Court objects to this idea and begins finding New Deal programs to be unconstitutional, striking them down. FDR responds with the idea of packing the Supreme Court or adding more justices until he has enough to get his way. So at the time, we had 9 Supreme Court justices. Still do. But FDR would have added, let's say, 10 more to make sure he has a solid majority. Now we have 19. So the next president adds 20 more. Then we have 39. So the next president has to add 40 more, which means we end up with 79. This process goes on and on and on until everyone on the planet becomes a Supreme Court justice. Keep in mind, there's no restrictions on the size, membership, etc. on the Supreme Court, so he can add whoever he wants, given advice and consent by the Senate. The public hated this idea and was fully against FDR's plan, but the Supreme Court feared he would do it anyway. They wanted to maintain their prestige as members of the court, so they suddenly reversed their course and realized that these New Deal programs were actually constitutional. This was significant because it meant that the federal government can now be more involved in regulating the economy. This second era showed that shift from a laissez-faire approach to a more hands-on approach. The third era we would look at is the civil rights and civil liberties era, and begins around 1940. I don't have much on this for this lecture because we're going to have 2 whole chapters devoted to these topics in the next section of the course, but this was about the relationship between the individual and the government, and what individuals can do, what rights government has to protect, things like that.